This video was brought to you by Helix, mattresses made to fit your body type and sleep position. Hello friends, my name is JJ. So a few months ago, I made a video explaining all of the entries on a Canadian iceberg chart, which, like most iceberg charts, was full of names of people and places and events that got progressively more disturbing the deeper you went. And this week, we got an all-new Canadian iceberg chart for you guys, featuring dozens of other increasingly weird and creepy Canadian things. So hold on to your hockey sticks, we're gonna do another deep dive. And once again, I will just say that some of the stuff on here does indeed get quite bleak and depressing, so viewer discretion is advised. Level 1, IKEA monkey. The IKEA monkey is probably one of the most famous memes Canada has ever produced. Basically, in 2012, an eccentric Toronto woman brought her pet monkey to the local IKEA. Though she left it locked in the car, it managed to escape and enter the store, where it caused much commotion among the shoppers, in part because it was wearing an adorable shearling coat. The monkey was ultimately seized by animal control, and there was a bit of a high-profile custody battle between the city and the monkey's owner, but the monkey's owner ultimately lost, and today, IKEA monkey lives comfortably in an Ontario primate sanctuary. Snit. So Snit is a somewhat grotesque puppet creature that was the co-host of these little segments on a TV channel for Canadian children known as YTV. Between cartoons, Snit and his co-host Phil would just banter about whatever and waste time. Some kids found Snit, who also had this very high-pitched, distorted voice, quite horrifying.
What, are we getting married, Phil?
But these days, I would say he is mostly just an object of millennial nostalgia. Saint Pierre and Miquelon. Saint Pierre and Miquelon are these two tiny islands off the coast of Newfoundland that are still legally French territory. They were basically a small concession given to the French after the British conquered most of French North America in 1763. For whatever reason, several thousand French citizens continue to live here, and to a large extent, the place is now increasingly run as a sort of weird and whimsical tourist destination for Canadians who have heard the legends. Star Wars Kid. The Star Wars Kid was a 15-year-old from Quebec named Ghislaine Raza, who in 2003 made a recording of himself practicing lightsaber moves, which some of his classmates surreptitiously posted online. This kid is probably up there with the IKEA monkey as the biggest meme that Canada has given the world. But unlike a lot of people who became memes, Ghislaine has always been quite bitter about the experience, never enjoying his fame, and always portraying what happened to him as something very dark and bleak.
Cette humiliation-là te suit partout.
The Dion quintuplets. The Dion quintuplets were 5 babies born to a French-Canadian woman in 1934 and were the most famous Canadians in the world for a time. Most people back then had never heard of quintuplets before, and the girls became a huge tourist attraction where people could come from all over to gawk at the freakish miracle.
We managed to drop in at feeding time, and here's Yvonne, who evidently thinks it's a fine idea. You come back. You want me to chase you all over Canada?
Today, of course, we look back at this whole episode as having been enormously exploitive and abusive, and the girls all grew up having all sorts of severe psychological problems. No rats in Alberta. This is a very beloved thing that people in Alberta like to believe about their province, and you sometimes see memes about it. This idea that Alberta is the only place in the world that is entirely rat-free. Alberta has a big agricultural sector, and in the late 1940s, their government mounted a pretty aggressive campaign, complete with World War II style propaganda, to push people to kill any rats they saw in order to protect the province's crops and livestock. And while that aggressive approach is considered to have been pretty effective overall, it would be overstating things to say that it has created a perfectly 100% rat-free province. What it has actually created is just a place that has a much more zero-tolerance attitude towards rats than other places. Layer 2. Zap the Safety Bird. Zap the Safety Bird is this incredibly poorly drawn cartoon bird that appears on warning labels found on electricity boxes in suburban Canadian neighborhoods. The character was apparently some sort of safety mascot for children in the 1980s or something, but he is now so long forgotten, and his depictions on the electricity boxes are so crude, people often have no clue at all what he is even supposed to be. and find the whole thing kind of creepy as a result. The idea that his red hat is actually supposed to be a pool of blood coming out of something that's been electrocuted is a common interpretation. The Badlands Guardian. The Badlands Guardian is the nickname of an area in rural Alberta where the hills and valleys seem to form the face of an Indian chief when viewed from the air. There is also a road leading to an oil well located in the chief's ear, which sort of makes it look like he's wearing headphones. Despite the fact that he looks like an indigenous guy, there is no evidence to suggest that this face in the hills was man-made. It's just a coincidence. It's an example of one of the many weird things that people have only discovered since the invention of Google Earth. Trump's Yukon brothel. So Donald Trump's German grandfather lived in Canada for several years. He moved to the Yukon during the big Klondike gold rush, where he ran a successful hotel for the traveling prospectors. And like many successful Klondike hotels of the time, it also doubled as a saloon and brothel. Prime Minister Trudeau gave President Trump a framed portrait of his grandfather's Canadian hotel during his 2018 visit to Canada, in what some at the time interpreted as a bit of a troll. Natural Law Party. The Natural Law Party was a fringe Canadian political party that was the subject of much mockery in the early 1990s. It was mostly based around crackpot New Age spiritualism, particularly transcendental meditation, and was led by this flaky former magician named Doug Henning.
I'm an expert in making things disappear. My Natural Law Party will make the problems of the nation disappear.
Their big thing was the idea of yogic flying, or the idea that if you meditated hard enough with your legs crossed, you could eventually levitate. But most of their practitioners could never do better than this. Grey Owl. So Grey Owl was an indigenous man who lived in northern Canada and was a huge global celebrity during the 1930s. He was a writer and a speaker, and basically very much embodied a certain heroic ideal of the wise Indian elder dispensing sage advice about the need to respect the environment and the First Nations of North America and their traditional way of life. After he died in 1938, it was revealed that he was not in fact a native elder at all, but simply a white guy from England who had worn makeup and dyed his hair and successfully fooled everyone into going along with his cosplay fantasy. Sort of the Rachel Dolezal of his time. The Salmon Arm Salute. So in 1982, a train containing Prime Minister Pierre Elliott Trudeau passed through the rural community of Salmon Arm, British Columbia. This was during the height of the old man Trudeau's unpopularity in Western Canada, and a crowd gathered to protest his passage through their city, jeering and waving signs and throwing eggs at his train car. The Prime Minister responded by glowering at them through the window and flipping his middle finger. This was considered a hugely shocking and offensive thing for a prime minister to do, and severely damaged his reputation for the rest of his life. I remember that even when he died, this was still something that people constantly brought up. But what is also kind of remarkable is that no one took a photo of him doing it, which has only made the episode seem even more legendary. The cartoonist at the Vancouver Sun did a drawing based on the witness descriptions, and this is about as close as we've ever gotten. Layer 3. The Beatles continued in Canada. During the 1970s, there was a popular conspiracy theory that a minor Canadian rock band called Klaatu was actually the reunited Beatles secretly plotting their big comeback. They sound kind of Beatles-like, I guess. Wild camels in British Columbia. In the 1860s, there was a massive gold rush in British Columbia centered around the remote community of the Caribou. There were no cars or trains or really even roads in those days, so people in the more populated areas of the province had to come up with creative schemes to get themselves and all of their equipment to this isolated area in the middle of the wilderness. One group of ambitious prospectors got the idea of importing camels to use as pack mules, but the camels proved useless, and after just a few months of trying to get them to cooperate, the prospectors just set them free into the wilds of British Columbia. Some of them managed to survive, and for decades afterwards, people would still occasionally spot wild camels in the interior of the province. It is theoretically possible that there could still be some wild camels out there to this day. Attempt to annex Hawaii. Sir Stanford Fleming, who lived in the late 19th century, is considered one of Canada's great inventors, associated with the creation of our modern system of time zones, among other things. He was also a big imperialist and a big believer in the idea that the British Empire should be tied together with the revolutionary communications technology of the time, the telegraph. Fleming was accordingly a big pusher of a plan to build a giant underwater telegraph line from Vancouver to New Zealand, but for logistical reasons, there would have to be a stop along the way. So Fleming proposed that Canada annex part of Hawaii, which was still an independent country at the time, to use as a telegraph station. When the government failed to endorse this scheme, Fleming secretly commissioned a retired naval captain to just sail over there and annex an island for him, but the British tipped off the Hawaiians before he could get there, so obviously it never happened. "O Canada" is plagiarized. The opening bars of the Canadian national anthem sound suspiciously similar to the opening bars of a Mozart song called March of the Priests. The true government of Belarus. There is a woman named Ivanka Servila who lives in Toronto and claims to be the legitimate president of Belarus. This is because after the Soviet Union first took over Belarus in the aftermath of World War I, people associated with the previous Belarusian government fled into exile. They bounced around Europe for several decades before settling on Canada in the 1970s. But that said, the people running the Belarusian Republic in exile don't really take themselves that literally anymore. They operate more as a network of activists of people opposed to the current Belarusian dictatorship. Al Capone in Saskatchewan. So, in the late 19th century, Saskatchewan was a more important part of Canada than it is now. And as a result, there was a train line that went straight from Moose Jaw, which was the major city of the time, to Chicago, which is of course the major city of the American Midwest. During the Prohibition era, this increasingly anachronistic train route was exploited by Chicago gangsters to hide liquor, or even themselves, in Saskatchewan. There is some evidence that Al Capone himself even spent some time in Moose Jaw to oversee this part of his rum-running empire. All right, so that about does it for the first 3 tiers of the old iceberg. From here on out, things are gonna start to get a bit more creepy and disturbing. If you are easily scared, some of this stuff might even keep you up at night. But you know what won't keep you up at night? Today's video sponsor, Helix mattresses. Hello friends, JJ here, coming to you from the sleeping zone of my fabulous studio apartment. As you can see, because space is limited here in the studio apartment, I actually sleep on what we call a loft bed. It is not a bunk bed. Bunk beds are for children. This is a space-saving loft bed. I have a twin-size bed, and yes, I know what you're all thinking. Twin-size bed? Really, JJ? But no, it's true. I have a twin-size bed, despite the fact that my sibling is 2 years younger than me, but you know, it's not just for biological twins anymore. But anyway, here in this box, I have my new Helix twin-size mattress, and I'm really excited to put it up there. So let's give it a try. That's pretty amazing. They have it all like shrink wrapped. It's like a big steak. That is incredible. It puffs up like a balloon. The mattress now looks like it's as puffy as it's gonna get. So let's put her up there in the loft bed and see how she feels. Okay, that was harder than I thought it would be, but I'm excited to relax now. Okay, so other than fun packaging, what are some of the other reasons you should give Helix a try? 1, customization. Helix serves up a personalized mattress based on the answers you give them in their little sleep quiz. 2, good return policy. You get a 100-day trial followed by full refund and pickup. And 3, a discount from your old buddy JJ. If you click on the link in the thing below or go to helixsleep.com/JJMC, you can get up to $200 off your next order and 2 free pillows. Plus, Helix mattresses have a 10-year warranty, flexible payment plans, and free shipping within the US. So don't delay, give Helix a try today, and now, back to the iceberg. Layer 4, alien skulls. Certain indigenous tribes on Canada's west coast practiced an unusual custom known as headboarding, wherein pressure would be applied to a baby's soft skull in order to make it grow into a certain flat flat or elongated shape in adulthood. There is a whole conspiracy theory subculture that denies this, however, and says that the elongated skulls that turn up in British Columbia from time to time are actually evidence of some alien race, or at least an alien-human hybrid race, Project Oil Sands. So Alberta is home to enormous quantities of bitumen, which is basically crude oil mixed with dirt. The oil is very valuable and can still be used, but only if it can be extracted from the dirt, which is very expensive and time-consuming. In the late 1950s, however, the government of Alberta came up with a shortcut scheme wherein they would liquefy the oil by setting off nuclear bombs underground. When the federal government got word of this, they put a stop to it. Canada killed Houdini. So in 1926, the great magician and escape artist Harry Houdini came up to Quebec to do a couple of shows in Montreal. One day, while he was chilling in his dressing room at the theater, he was visited by some students from the nearby McGill University. And as the story goes, one of the students asked if it was true that Houdini could take a punch to the stomach. And he said he could because even at 52, Houdini was a pretty jacked guy with strong abs. But then the student just takes this as an invitation to start wailing on him in the stomach before Houdini had a chance to flex or anything. And it's believed that this is what caused the ruptured appendix that killed the greatest entertainer of the Victorian age a few days later. The Manitoba Parliament is a Masonic temple. The Manitoba Provincial Legislature in Winnipeg is one of those public buildings that has so many odd and inexplicable architectural flourishes that it's invited a lot of conspiracy theories over the years. The most popular one is that it is some sort of secret Masonic temple, and that all of the weird things are secret Masonic symbols. Missing Trudeau blackface. So when Prime Minister Trudeau had his big blackface scandal a few years back, in which it was revealed that he had repeatedly worn blackface as a younger man, one early aspect of the story was figuring out just exactly how many times he had dressed up this way. Reporters dug up multiple photos taken at multiple different events, which invited suspicion that there was even more to come. When asked how many times he did it, Trudeau always responded ambiguously, suggesting that he either couldn't remember or didn't want to go on the record with a specific number. Either way, that does suggest that there are probably more photos and videos of him out there wearing blackface than we have seen so far. Ruined Constitution. In 1982, Queen Elizabeth came to Canada and signed something called the Constitution Act, a very important document that gave Canada its final independence from Great Britain. Unfortunately, the weather was very bad that day, and the original document was ruined by the rain. There was a backup copy made, but in 1983, an anti-American protester poured red paint all over it. Level 5. Gerald Bull. Gerald Bull was a notorious Canadian arms dealer. He was initially a brilliant weapons scientist who worked for the Canadian military in the 1950s and 60s, but when the government pulled funding for his experiments, he started seeking out darker projects. His company covertly sold arms to apartheid South Africa during a time when the country was under an international arms embargo, and most infamously, he was recruited by Saddam Hussein to work on Project Babylon, an Iraqi plan to develop a so-called supergun. Bull was murdered in 1990 under suspicious circumstances, and there have always been a lot of conspiracy theories associated with his life and death. Ice mummies. In the 1980s, archaeologists uncovered 3 perfectly preserved frozen corpses from Beechey Island in the Northwest Territories. They were sailors who had been part of the Franklin expedition, which was a famous British exploration of the Canadian Arctic in 1845 that ended disastrously when the ships got stuck in the ice and all 129 men on board starved to death. Remnants of the other sailors would eventually be found as well, many of their bones scarred with human teeth marks. Headless Valley. Headless Valley is a nickname for the Nahanni Valley National Park in the Northwest Territories, a place that has long been considered one of the most haunted and mysterious places in Canada. The nickname comes from the fact that during the early 20th century, a number of explorers who went up there looking for gold were later found with their heads missing. Almost every type of legend imaginable has been associated with the place, including rare and dangerous cryptids, ghosts, and even UFOs. It's considered a sacred place to the Dene people, and it is located in such a remote part of Canada that it is very difficult to visit, which only adds to its mystery. Jerome. In 1863, a man with no legs washed up on the coast of Nova Scotia. He was unable to speak, but the seaside community, who named him Jerome, took care of him, and he was able to live relatively well for the next 50 years. No one ever figured out who he was or where he came from, however, and he has remained one of Canada's most bizarre or unsolved mysteries for over 150 years. Bountiful. Bountiful is a colony of dissident Mormon fundamentalists in rural British Columbia. It is a deeply weird community of around 1,000 people that came to mainstream attention in the late 2000s when the government announced it would be pursuing polygamy charges against its leaders, who, in traditional fundamentalist Mormon fashion, had accumulated multiple wives. In 2017, Winston Blackmore, the former head of the colony, became one of the first Canadian men in over a century to be found guilty of polygamy. He had 24 wives with whom he had fathered 150 children. Angelique. In 1734, there was a big fire that burned down much of colonial Montreal. It was blamed on a slave woman named Mary Joseph Angelique, who was brutally tortured, hung, had her corpse put on public display, and then burned. Layer 6. Air India. In 1985, Sikh fundamentalists based in Vancouver planted bombs on Air India Flight 182, which was headed for Mumbai. It exploded over the Atlantic Ocean, killing all 329 people on board. It was the worst terrorist attack in North American history prior to 9/11. Due to the incredible incompetence on the part of the Canadian police and prosecutors, the men responsible for the Air India bombing were never found guilty and were able to go free, making the episode not only the worst mass murder in Canadian history, but also its most notorious miscarriage of justice. Agent Orange. Agent Orange is the name of a powerful herbicide or plant killer that causes severe side effects in humans. Canadian chemical firms were a leading producer of Agent Orange during the 50s, 60s, and 70s and actively promoted its use. For decades, the Ontario government sprayed huge amounts of Agent Orange to clear out trees for construction projects like highways. Canadian-made Agent Orange was also used extensively by the US military during the Vietnam War to get rid of jungle foliage. The US military learned how to do this through extensive testing that they did in Canada. While the Vietnamese are the most well-known victims of Agent Orange, which has caused many types of birth defects and cancers, it has also poisoned many people in the areas of Canada where it was used or produced as well. Starlight tours. So-called starlight tours are a very infamous practice in Saskatchewan in which cops are said to deal with drunken native men by driving them to the outskirts of town and then just dumping them there to find their own way home. This is seen as a uniquely torturous thing to do given how cold Saskatchewan nights can get, but Aboriginal people in Saskatchewan have long maintained its common practice. In the last 20 years, there have been around a half dozen high-profile freezing deaths of native men blamed on starlight tours. Order of the Solar Temple. The Order of the Solar Temple was an apocalyptic cult that enjoyed some degree of popularity in Quebec during the late 20th century. It was founded by a Frenchman named Joseph de Mombreau, who had moved to Quebec in 1986 and preached what the CBC describes as a strange mix of Catholicism, Rosicrucian beliefs, elements of ancient Egyptian beliefs, shamanism, and doomsday scenarios, combined with Templar-like mystical rituals and regalia, and a strict hierarchy where one advanced through financial donations. The cult, which was also popular in other French-speaking countries, was notable for attracting members of the Quebec elite, including politicians and journalists. They had a few episodes of mass suicides, which were carried out in a much more gruesome manner than most other cults. A common tactic was for people to set their houses on fire and burn themselves to death.
Police have confirmed that Canadian Joseph de Mombreau, one of the cult's masterminds, was among the 53 people found dead last week.
Russell Williams. Russell Williams was a highly respected senior officer in the Canadian Air Force. He was in charge of VIP transportation, which included flying around prime ministers, royalty, and foreign dignitaries. Behind the scenes, however, he was a man entirely in thrall to his twisted sexual addictions. He broke into dozens of women's homes to steal or wear their lingerie, eventually just progressing into serial sexual assault. In 2010, he pled guilty to murdering 2 of his victims. Kevin Annett. Kevin Annett is a notorious Canadian conspiracy theorist, a man who spent decades making the wildest claims imaginable.
You're a sovereign being living on land. They can't have that because, of course, the whole Agenda 2030 is to urbanize the whole world population, seize all land, create a permanent slave population. That's what the fake COVID thing is all about under the guise of a public health crisis. They're enacting that.
What makes Annett an increasingly difficult figure these days, however, is the fact that his long-standing allegation that Canada's leaders used the Indian residential schools program to mass murder Indian children seems to increasingly align with the mainstream view of the schools, which even the Pope himself recently called genocidal. Annett's supporters would say that this vindicates him, but his critics would say that he is simply muddying the truth of a serious situation with his extremist nonsense and making it harder for the public to separate reality from fiction. Layer 7, Goler clan. The Goler clan were a large family who lived for many generations in the hills of rural Nova Scotia. They were extremely isolated and poor, living well into the late 20th century in a cramped shack without plumbing or heating. They were also severely inbred and all had sex with each other, including the children. In 1984, the police finally got word of them, and over 137 counts of sexual abuse and incest were charged against over a dozen Goler family members. Asbestos. Asbestos is a fiber-like mineral that can be used to make insulation for buildings, and Quebec is home to some of the largest deposits of it in the entire world. For much of the post-war period, Canada was the world's largest asbestos exporter. Asbestos is also highly carcinogenic, and an extremely deadly form of lung cancer, known as mesothelioma, is caused almost exclusively by exposure to asbestos. This was common knowledge by the 1970s, but due to the power of the Canadian asbestos industry, the Canadian government long resisted efforts to regulate or ban the use of the product, long after most of the civilized world did, and resisted international efforts to regulate or ban it as well. Well into the 2000s, Canada was continuing to export hundreds of thousands of tons of asbestos, mostly to third world countries with lax public safety laws. It can easily be argued that the Canadian asbestos industry is the country's greatest crime against humanity, as it's almost certainly been responsible for tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of deaths. The Canadian Airborne Regiment. The Canadian Airborne Regiment was a unit of the Canadian Army that for many years served as a kind of dumping ground for problem soldiers who officers in other units didn't want to deal with. It became known as a hive of the worst sort of young men, violent and disobedient drunks and racists known for subjecting each other to cruel and sadistic hazing rituals. Nevertheless, in late 1992, the unit was deployed to Somalia as part of Canada's humanitarian mission there. The Canadian Airborne Regiment soldiers proceeded to behave in various appalling ways towards the civilian population. In one incident, they set a trap of food and water, and when a Somali man tried to get to it, they shot his body to pieces. In the most notorious episode, a Somali teenager wandered into the Canadian base and was captured by Canadian soldiers who proceeded to spend hours viciously torturing him to death. They then posed for photos with his mutilated corpse. When news of this got back to Canada in 1994, the administration of Prime Minister Jean Chrétien responded by permanently dissolving the Canadian Airborne Regiment. However, a full government investigation into the activities of the unit was shut down prematurely for what are believed to have been political reasons, meaning a lot of the precise details of atrocities committed by Canadian soldiers against civilians in Somalia have never been made fully known. The Ken and Barbie killers. This is an incredibly disturbing story, so I'm just going to breeze through the details quickly. There was an attractive young married couple from Ontario, Paul Bernardo and Carla Homolka. They also had an incredibly evil fetish, which was abusing prepubescent girls in various horrific ways, which they often filmed. Several of the girls they tortured, including Carla Homolka's own sister, were killed during the course of it, and the ensuing multiple murder trial of this unspeakably sick couple gripped the nation in the early 1990s. Carla Homolka was released from prison in 2005 and might be the single most hated Canadian person living today. Piggy's Palace. Willie Pickton was the most notorious serial killer in Canadian history. He was a pig farmer from British Columbia who is believed to have killed at least 49 prostitutes during the course of his lifetime and buried their bodies at his farm. In 2007, he was given 6 life sentences. I remember reading about some of the things that Pickton was alleged to have done with the bodies of the women that he killed, and it was so repulsive that it still haunts me. But equally creepy was the fact that for a long time, Pickton was considered a sort of charming local eccentric in his suburban community, often hosting big parties at his farm, which was known as Piggy's Palace. His innocuous reputation almost certainly allowed him to get away with his crimes for as long as he did. Okay, once again, I am ready for a break after all of that bleak stuff. Nevertheless, I hope you did learn a few interesting things about Canada, which is obviously a country with more than a few skeletons in its closet, among other places. Is there anything you think belongs on a Canadian iceberg? Let me know in the comments. But first, don't forget to check out my other Canadian iceberg video, which contains many of the other biggies. Thank you so much for watching. Do not forget to check out Helix mattresses, and I will see you next week.